This lecture series has been woven around the theme of inclusion of the excluded. We've had the privilege of looking at this issue through a range of speakers covering aspects such as journalism, culture, education, civil society, theater, and art. Today in our midst, we have Professor U.R.Anathamurthy, well-known contemporary novelist, short story writer, and critic in Kannada literature. Professor Ananthamurthy is one of the most important representatives of the Navya movement, or the new movement as it is called, in literature of the Kannada language, and is counted among the most eminent Indian authors. Most of his works have been translated into a number of languages, both Indian and for English. The predominating theme of his short stories, plays, poems, and talks, if I may say so, include caste system, religious rules, traditions, and the new values of a changing world.
First of all, on behalf of the university and on my personal behalf, let me welcome Professor U.R.Anathamurthy to Indira Gandhi National Open University. During the last few years, this university has been trying to network with institutions and individuals in different spheres to provide the knowledge and skills which are required for improving the quality of life in the society. This university is also different in many ways. We look at the educational infrastructure and intellectual capabilities available outside the formal confines of the education departments or the university's four walls. We look at the society in a broader context and then try to tap the best out of it so that we can provide education and skills. I welcome you, sir, for this lecture as well as Tagore Chair Professor in Indira Gandhi National Open University. I also take this opportunity of course, she is our own professor, she is Ambedkar Chair. Another very important activity which is happening during the last 1 year in this university, and on social mobility, activities on social mobility. I am glad that Gail Omworth has accepted to be a discussant for today's lecture, and her work is closely related to this particular theme Professor Ananthamurthy has selected. Once again, let me thank and appreciate the efforts taken by the Silver Jubilee Organizing Committee to identify the best people in the world to come to IGNOU and then give these Silver Jubilee lectures very systematically. Thank you very much.
My first proposition is, when I say Indian literature, I don't mean only the written literature. In India, literature which is written is of course alive among the 20 or 30% literate people, among whom a smaller number speak or write or read these books. But a larger number participate in an imaginative world which is oral literature. So we have more people for what I call literature, if you include oral literature also as Indian literature. If I include oral literature, then I include even the Vedas, because that was once oral literature. But the Dalits had their own oral literature, particularly in Canada from the 14th and 15th century onwards. So I'm going to include that also when I talk about Dalit contribution to Indian literature, not merely a contribution of those who come with the influence of Gandhi and Ambedkar, but those who came under the influence of the great saint poets of our country. I am mostly dealing with people from Karnataka because that's the area I know. But when I speak, the others can include figures from their own languages into the kind of scheme that I am trying to build up. There is literature. If you come to Mysore, In certain months, you will hear a woman recite an oral epic for 7 days, and it would go into several thousand pages. And this is a Dalit woman. And they would also come with big symbols. They dance, they sing, and it is not merely literature for them, it's a kind of a religious rite also. So it has that kind of an extension to it, it's literature. And now they have been collected and even translated into English. Sahitya Academy has brought out a translation of an oral epic. And so my first statement is, don't hegemonize written literature, but think of all literature is basically oral. And great poets who write their poems also somewhere are oral. And they are poets when they recite their poems. And it happens with a kind of immediacy. And literature which has lost its oral quality is no longer good literature. So that is one of the tests of literature, is that it has still retained an oral quality. Whenever it goes dead, it goes back to the spoken word, and hence that is the source. And the spoken word is kept alive by the lowest of the low in our society. Particularly all the Indian languages, I have sometimes said they will live because there are enough backward people in India. And I don't mean it cynically, but those who retain the languages are those who are backward. And they retain the language and they have kept it alive for others to work on and then even bring it forward, but they have the phrase, the musical note, and such wonderful statements. We call them proverbs. Proverbs are like Vedas, for the poor. That's also a part of Dalit literature. And many radical progressive thinkers don't take this into consideration, the oral part of the Dalit literature. And hence many theories that have come on Dalit literature is mostly based on realistic renderings of Dalit experience. I am not excluding it, I am including it into the oral. Then it becomes richer. When I say the oral literature, it has several functions. And one of the functions that many commentators think is that it helps Dalits to come up in life. In other words, M.N. Srinivasa's idea of Sanskritization. So they also create their own myth and they graft it on the other myths, and that's a way of coming up. But if you look closely into the content of it, it is not merely an aspiration to go higher, which makes these myths possible, but it is also a debunking of the myths of the upper classes. So Dalit epics also have intertextual elements. The intertextual should not be read in a simplistic manner, but it should be read as a way of participation and also opposition. And now I come to my main thesis, which I build these topics on a main thesis that I have, that Indian literature has a front yard and a backyard. And a lot of our literature, new themes and so on, have come from the backyard. Themes like Ramayana, Bharata, and heroic themes may come from the front yard, but the backyard has other kinds of themes which has enriched Indian literature. So Indian languages have a backyard. And I think English also has a backyard. If English did not have India as a backyard, English literature would not have grown. Or Ireland as a backyard. Or Africa as a backyard. Sanskrit is the only language which has no backyard, but in its backyard are the regional languages. So Sanskrit can still be alive through these regional languages. So something in the backyard, which is very important for literature. However hegemonic is your society, there is always something that defies all social arrangements so far as literary imagination is concerned. Literary imagination, metaphorical imagination, has that kind of capacity. Now, what has happened to new writing in Kannada literature? I will tell you when it all begins. It began in Maharashtra. I first read about it from my friend Dilip Chitre, who translated some of these Dalit poets in an English newspaper. So it was through the English language that I came to know of Dalit literature in Maharashtra. 1,000 years ago, or even 500 years ago, they would have come to know, these bhakti poets came to know of each other without the intervention of the English language. But now it is the English language which brings even the news of Dalit literature from Maharashtra to Karnataka. But in Karnataka there was a movement, a Dalit movement, as a result of a very simple political statement made by one of our Dalit ministers, who was a very active person in his social thinking. He was deeply influenced by Ambedkar and by the Buddha. He was a very active man called Basulingappa. And then some of the major writers in Kannada, like Kuampu, who was a very great poet, also came in support of Basulingappa's statement. So that led to a big movement, and it became a literary movement. And then many Dalit writers began to write and express themselves. So it was a very important event in Kannada. It happened in the 70s. And Basulingappa was an instrument in doing that. And then we got a very important writer in Kannada at that time, two important writers. One was Siddhalingaya, who wrote poetry of a progressive kind. It is not essentially Dalit in that sense, because we had also a progressive literary movement based on Marxism and communism and so on. It was called Bandaya. But the Dalit was different from that, according to me, that it had Bandaya, but it also had an idiom that the Dalits use in everyday life. That means when you have a new movement, it is not only a new movement of content, but it is a new movement of idiom. The idiom changes. So when I go to the 14th and 15th century epics, which I will in a few minutes, you will see how there is a new idiom also in them. Devanur Mahadeva was the first Dalit writer using a Dalit variation of Kannada. As I am told, the Marathi writers also use a variation of Marathi, not the Marathi of the well-to-do, the middle classes. Now the Dalit experience of humility and of humbleness and humiliation is often expressed, I think, in three different ways by great writers. One is the high mimetic way. Much earlier than Devanur Mahadeva, a great writer in Kannada, a Brahmin writer from South Karnataka called Shivaram Karar, had written a story called Chomana Dudi, Choma's Drum, which also became a film later on. And when you read Choma's Dudi, which I read as a child, as a matter of fact, I come from a Brahmin family. If my ideas of the whole caste system changed, living in an agrahara in Karnataka, where there was no newspaper, nothing of that kind, I used to go to a school, of course, walking 4 miles. It was my coming across this novel Chomana Dudi. It was a very strange experience. The caste system produces such strange experiences. I saw a Dalit every day in my backyard when he came to the cattle shed to take away the dung. But I never thought that he had an inner life. I thought he was just some name who came and did it and went away without talking to anyone. But when I read Choma's Drum, where Karant writes about Choma's agony, Choma's sorrow, Choma's anger, it suddenly struck me the man whom I see every day has an inner life. You know, this is a very strange experience. To think that somebody whom you have ignored all your life has an inner life of his own. I cannot describe to you that how it made me a writer. Just the discovery that somebody whom you socially treat as an asprucia has an inner life and can dislike you, hate you, and not express it. So that became a mystery for me, reading that novel. So it was what I call in literature in the high mimetic mode. Choma is almost like King Lear, losing his children and his self-respect. And in the end, he dies beating the drum. It's in the high mimetic mode. But there was another novel, again by a caste Hindu. It's a very important novel with Dalit experience embedded in it by a writer called Kuvempu. He is a middle caste man, you know, not the upper caste, but the middle caste, the land-owning caste. So he has a novel where there is a fantastic character who goes everywhere with a dog of his own. He is called Nai Gutti. Nobody calls him Gutti, but Nai. Nai is a dog Gutti. So there is one extraordinary passage in that. So in spite of your hegemony and untouchability and so on, what happens within the minds of characters? That's why literature is always a source where you will find things which you may not have found expressed obviously in society, but expressed within. And so the Dalit literature is not the same kind everywhere. I think it's different in Canada for some reasons. I don't know what reasons, but that is what I want to find out. But it has taken a different kind of a direction in Canada of this kind of a story. So they came into the mainstream immediately. So although they were Dalits writing, we never thought of making some kind of a concession for this kind of writing because it is written by a Dalit, because it was as good or even better than what others were writing, because it was deeply metaphorical and went deeper into social reality and said many more things than realistic literature could have said. With realistic literature, you either agree or disagree. With this, there is no agreement or disagreement, but only participation. That's why how Dalit literature came into us. Now, a friend of mine has written a very profound book on this whole movement and the way it has been used. This is Dr. D.R. Nagaraj, who is no more now. He wrote a long book on Shaiva Pratibhe and the Kavya Mimamsa there, and he uses a Rilke poem. Rilke has a poem where what has become the golden coin and accepted in the nation as a coin suddenly has a desire to go back to its origin and become the ore again. The coin begins to want to become the ore again. Now, many of these kavyas have the desire to become the ore again, because they know that what has become nanya, that which is used in everyday life, is no longer contains the original value of what they stood for. And hence they want to go back to the war. And hence there is that kind of a pull within Dalit literature in Karnataka, because it has a past of this kind, the 14th century and 15th century. The modern writer no longer has to go to world literature of this kind for his inspiration. He has within his own tradition an inspiration of a kind where you can turn your social rebellion into metaphorical rebellion, deeper kind of rebellion, a universal kind of rebellion, and sound in literature deeper themes which are as deep as anything that the upper class literature can ever produce. And hence Dalit literature, contribution to Dalit literature, I use it only for convenience. Otherwise, it is the Dalits who have made a great contribution to literature because they have brought literature back to its original values. So in other words, in my metaphor, the backyard has asserted itself and is in the front yard and may be in danger of suffering the same fate as whatever is in the front yard. And then something else may have to come from the backyard, even from the Dalits, because this may also become a thing, which is repeated quite often and lose its value. That may happen, but fortunately for us in India, there is a great backyard of unspoken things, metaphors, language uses in all the Indian languages, and a great source for the literary expression of this kind of pain is what happened in the Bhakti Panth at that time. Kabir and Basava in my language, Allama, Dohar Kakkaya. They all, it's very interesting, when you talk of any of these poets, you talk of their trade also. So their assertion of what they do. There is no shame. That was what I think Basava tried to do, take the shame away from what you do. In other words, it was a movement of great depth and great insight. And Dalits are proud to have got it. But even before Dalits got it, upper caste people also made use of these Dalit epics and wrote poems for printing and reading, but they were never as effective as the thing which is delivered even today by word of mouth. I am not talking about something which has disappeared, it is still alive. And still alive for our writers, whether they are upper caste or lower caste, these women are there who can sing them for 7 days. But there are variations of this, variations because each woman will add something to it from her own experience. So it is not something there for you to copy, but you can enter into it also. And hence those who have edited it have had a very hard job because they had to hear many of these women singing this and then choose the patha, text, which they think is common to them all and make a part of it. But it's always doubted whether there is another which is better than this. So on the whole, my gist of my speech today is when you think of Indian contribution, the Dalit contribution to Indian literature, we need not think of it only of our time of enlightenment, where they have asserted themselves, of a longer time in India, at least from what you call the medieval. The medieval in India is not like the medieval in Europe. The medieval India was much more alive than the medieval Europe. The Dalits have made many transformations. I have some examples I will tell you. The Lingayats speak of the Ishtalinga on the palm, but the Dalits speak of the fire in the palm. They don't use the word linga, but fire. When they say that he has come as fire, they don't mean merely the fire that you see in the sun or in the sky. They also mean Minukuhula, the little worm which has light, the light worm. So in other words, they go into the everyday detail and find their source of inspiration. That's one difference between the Dalit epic and the other epics. So the everyday life is glorified in the Dalit, but grafted on to the older poets, grafted not because they want to imitate it, but also to debunk it. And hence it does two things at the same time. One is, it you begin to belong to the greater tradition. And two, you assert your own identity. These twin jobs are done in Dalit literature. That's why I think it is something unique, very important in our own times. Thank you very much.
Dalit literature has made some very definite contributions. As I've said, it's shaken up the literary establishment, brought forward, it's produced some very powerful autobiographies, some very powerful poetry, beautiful poetry, angry poetry. In Marathi, people like Namdeo Desal, Daya Pawar, and so on. And there are some good translations available. Poison Bread as an anthology of Marathi literature, I think, is probably one of the best ones. So it's now very widely accessible. At the same time, I think in some ways, Dalit literature is reaching a stage of crisis. One question, I would have been thinking of is, at least in Marathi, and I think this is true in other languages also, we've not yet seen a good novel by a Dalit writer. And I've read a translation of a novel from Tamil Nadu, but it's really from the perspective of a Dalit community in a village. And this is something to think about, because I think what it takes to write a really good novel is a look at the whole society, and a look from the perspective not only of the excluded, but also of the partially included, the partially excluded, the excluders themselves. So it has to be in that sense all around.